Now, you might be thinking, Callum, isn't it a little hyperbolic to call NEOM an atrocity? Sure, the designs are a little strange, but the designs certainly aren't worthy of being labelled as an atrocity, right? Well, to learn about what makes NEOM an atrocity, there's some context and history of architecture that many of you might not be aware of. So join me, Callum, an architect here at Studio Null, and let's burn some bridges together. Architects and dictators, their titles unfortunately sometimes go hand in hand. Perhaps that comes as no surprise when some of the most famous architects have quotes such as Le Corbusier's The Plan, totalitarian, in which he sees himself as a good totalitarian who would lead humanity to flourish, or perhaps even a modern piece for the RIBA journal written by Will Wheels, called Hooray for Despotism. The stereotype points to architects' real value, where he states any dictatorial tendencies on the part of architects are demanded by the job fundamentally. Non-architects want and need architects to dictate in detail because no one else will. So according to Will Wheels, architects are just inherently dictators, and that's a good thing. However, the dictator architect stereotype is not something I care much about, but architects working with dictators, now that on the other hand is more interesting. Let's take Jacques Engels, the founder of BIG, who came under scrutiny in 2020 after he met with Bolsonaro, the right-wing Brazilian president who, although not explicitly a dictator, has on many occasions celebrated the previous military dictatorship and even attempted to have his own political rival assassinated. But Jacques' response to that criticism of his visit was that creating a list of countries or companies that BIG should shy away from working with seems to be an oversimplification of a complex world. He even goes on to praise Bolsonaro as he states it was a government that is willing to listen. Bolsonaro, famously a man who stated he was favourable to torture, and a man who, while discussing a survey about Brazilian police being the world's largest killers, his response was, the military of police should kill more. But don't worry guys, he is very willing to listen, and it would be too simple to not work with him. But it's not just Jacques Engels. Zaha Hadid also worked with Qatar to create a stadium for the 2022 World Cup, an event marred by accusations of sport washing due to the treatment of workers by Qatar. Her response was simply, I have nothing to do with the workers, except for the fact that they were building what their company had designed, and if they had decided to walk away and take their plans with them, Qatar would have been screwed. Jean Nouvel, who has become a favourite of the Gulf monarchs, has designed the Louvre Abu Dhabi, the National Museum of Qatar, and a resort in Saudi Arabia, though he simply dismissed the critical claims as calling them an old question. Maybe Frank Gehry, who stated, I think the best thing is to have a benevolent dictator who has taste. This occurred during an interview in which he was discussing the merits of democracy. After all, he doesn't seem to be beholden to the merits of democracy, seeing as he has also worked with Abu Dhabi. It's not all architects though. Daniel Libeskind declared publicly in 2008 that he believed that architects should think long and hard before working with China. After spending a long and hard decade thinking about it, his firm proceeded to complete its first project in China for the Museum of Zhangjiadong. Literally a museum of a Chinese politician. This isn't a modern trend either. Walter Gropius and Le Corbusier both created designs for Saddam Hussein. Gropius designed the renovation of Baghdad University, and Le Corb planned an Olympic stadium for Baghdad. These architects are architects who gained such fame in the architectural world that it spills over into the general public. These architects have a track record of working and providing designs for dictators and authoritarian regimes, helping to sanitize and offer aesthetics to an otherwise horrific system, while always simply ignoring the plight that their designs bring forward in these states. Perhaps it begs the question of why so many wealthy people are more than happy to work with dictators. But we're just an architecture channel, that's not for me to figure out. Maybe someone else can, I don't know. I feel like someone called Vladimir would be perfect for the job. This trend of architects working with dictators began before the Nazis, but is very much alive today. On the 29th of October 2024, the Architects newspaper, one of the largest architectural magazines in the United States, released an article titled, "New Documentary Reveals that 21,000 labourers have died working on Saudi Vision 2030, which includes NEOM since construction began." The documentary in question is Kingdom Uncovered Inside Saudi Arabia, released by ITV. It states that more than 21,000 Indian, Bangladeshi and Nepalese workers have died in Saudi Arabia since 2017. Each of them worked on the various aspects of Mohammed bin Salman's Saudi Vision 2030. On top of this, on the 28th of October 2024, Hindustan Times, an Indian newspaper, stated in a report that there have been as many as 100,000 people who have simply disappeared during the construction of NEOM. Though this is after the 11th of September 2024, when the Wall Street Journal released a report that explored the racist white supremacist viewpoints of the managerial executives of NEOM, such as Wayne Borg, who stated on a phone call, "A whole bunch of people die, so we've got to have a meeting on a Sunday night." Later going on to state about the Indian workers who had died, "Fucking morons, and that is why white people are at the top of the pecking order." However, this all comes out after the 4th of May 2020, in which The Guardian released an article called "It's Being Built on Our Blood, the True Cost of Saudi Arabia's $500 billion megacity," which discloses that 20,000 members of the Huaytat tribe, a tribe indigenous to the region NEOM is constructing in, have been forcibly evicted from their land and home. This was after the article in 23rd of April 2020, released by BBC, called "Saudi Tribe Challenges Crown Prince's Plans for Tech City," in which it talks about Abdul Rahim Al-Huati, a member of the Huat tribe, who posted a video online about his refusal of the eviction orders from the Saudi regime, specifically stating in this video that Saudi forces would most likely attempt to incriminate him by planting weapons on his body. Only later, the Saudi state security confirmed his death, where they alleged that he had supposedly opened fire on security forces. Okay, so the death of an activist tribesman, 20,000 people having been ethnically displaced, 21,000 people having died, 100,000 people have disappeared, and the managers of the company are a bunch of white supremacists. But that begs a question. What even is NEOM? Currently, NEOM is the world's largest construction project. NEOM itself isn't just one project, but instead a multitude of different projects, which include Aqualum, Alana, Epicot, Godalry, Tremora, Leisure, Magna, Norlana, Oxicon, Sindala, Serrana, Beline, Prayama, Trodina, Utamo, Zeno, and Zodun. Currently, Saudi Arabia is the world's largest oil exporter, and it's where it derives the majority of its wealth. MBS's plan for Saudi Arabia 2030 aims to create an economy that can sustain itself beyond oil exports. Saudi Arabia 2030 is purely an investment scheme that aims to drive industries such as AI, tech, and a small, humble construction project called NEOM. Saudi Vision 2030 is heavily relying on NEOM to execute its plans to create a place like Dubai, replicating its capability to attract tourists, businesses, and foreign investment alike. This is done by the fact that the cities created by NEOM, specifically the line, are set to be private, so people can invest in the project, which will become a free trade zone with its own legal and tax system independent of Saudi Arabia. Despite several years having passed since its announcement, NEOM has only really started construction on 2 of the projects, the line and Sandala. This is also in addition to the fact that the line is intended to be 170 kilometers long, but is being constructed in stages. The original first stage was designed to be 16 kilometers by 2030, however it is likely to only be 2.4 kilometers at best. This has caused the original projection of 1.5 million residents to drop down to 30,000 residents. The Asian Winter Games also scheduled to take place in Saudi Arabia on the Trojena project, however construction has not even begun yet. Now look, for such a large dramatic undertaking that NEOM envisions, it needs people to actually design it. Here is where architects enter the scene. Dezeen released an article on the 25th of June 2024, which architecture studios are working on NEOM, in which it names and shames companies working with NEOM. It also states that Meneco, a Dutch studio, worked on the early designs for the Trojena project, however it no longer works with NEOM. Perhaps this is why that construction has not begun on this project. A few days later, on the 28th of June 2024, the Architects Journal released a report called More UK Practices Linked with Saudi Line as Morphosis Departs. This article named and shamed the 24 international practices that were involved in competitions at the time for work on the line. The US architectural firm Morphosis was originally the lead architect, however it ultimately decided to leave, with Austrian practice DMAA replacing Morphosis. Morphosis wasn't the only one to depart, however. Ajaya Associates, Coop Heblau, and HOK have also supposedly cut ties with them. Using the latest information on this subject, as of 28th of June 2024, the complete list of architectural companies working with NEOM is now displayed on screen. These companies are not only complicit in the crimes that the Saudi regime were and are committing, such as the genocide in Yemen. However, you could argue that they aren't complicit in that genocide because they don't have any direct involvement there. While ignoring that it's a stupid argument because boycotting a country is definitely something you can do, they are deeply involved in the crimes of NEOM. This mega project is only feasible with their cooperation. These mega projects could never see the light of day without their backing. NEOM is a project designed to generate international interest, and they are banking on the names of these internationally renowned architectural practices to help drive some of that. Saudi Arabia has recently come under accusations of sport washing due to its investment in my hometown club Newcastle United, as well as in golf and motorsports including F1. Sports washing is a term used to describe the practice of using sports to enhance a country's reputation, often to divert attention from human rights concerns, political controversies, or other negative aspects of its governance, such as the Nazis hosting the Olympics or the United States holding the World Cup or the Olympics in LA. Now, I would like to introduce a new and related term, archiwashing. You see, there are many reasons people travel to different places, but for many it is the place itself. They want to see the buildings, the architecture that is there. There have been numerous studies examining the relationship between architecture and tourism. Now, I am an architect, and I am very much a person who goes on holiday to just look at pretty buildings. I know I'm not exactly normal, but you'll just have to trust me, there are multiple studies linking architecture with tourism. Here's a quick check though. I bet there's a whole lot of you who know that the Burj Khalifa in Dubai is the world's tallest building. The reason you know that is purely because it serves an advertising mechanism to attract people to visit. Well, the Burj Khalifa won't be the tallest building forever, as it will be replaced by the Burj Khalifa in Saudi Arabia once it finishes construction, building designed by Adrian Smith, an American architect. Saudi Arabia plans to explicitly use its NEOM project to archiwash its reputation. Sport washing attracts the tourists to initially visit, and then they discover the beauty of the country, they tell their friends, and the reputation spreads, leading to increased tourism. This is also specifically why they aren't using local architects. There are almost certainly plenty of talented architects in these countries who could come up with some beautiful buildings given the chance, even the ones that embrace the traditional local vernacular of the area. However, they are instead choosing international architects as they are designing for an international audience. Now, I'm not just taking aim at the companies working on NEOM. The RIBA can also be implicated in this, as RIBA Chief Executive Valerie Von Dyck, alongside ALA's principal Amanda Levitt and Heatherwick Studios founder Thomas Heatherwick, all appeared on UK Saudi Trade Panel, which discussed the UK and KSA experience on creating built environments that are sustainable, healthy, and support community well-being. The RIBA and Heatherwick's response were terrible to say the least, as they were under scrutiny at the time. as this was not long after the Saudi regime had killed Abdul Rahim al-Wati and during the genocide they were committing in Yemen. I'm not going to say their complete responses, still you can pause and read them for yourselves and see how essentially both parties failed to apologise or failed to even denounce the atrocities that the Saudi regime is committing. I'm not showing ALA's response because they simply refused to respond. Quite frankly, it's astonishing just how many companies are somehow being outflanked on this issue by a company which is protecting its CEO from several sexual harassment allegations from their female employees. Wait, what's this? So, since I started this video, there's been some news about NEOM. Yeah, you see, remember the line? Yeah, the 170km long city. Well, it's cancelled. Shit! You could have waited till I finish editing the video at least to drop this! So let's try and figure out what is actually happening together. It seems all of this comes from a statement that was made during the Future Investment Initiative's 9th Annual Finance Conference on the 28th of October in Riyadh, where it was stated to a Reuters reporter that Saudi Arabia is preparing to shift $925 billion of its sovereign wealth fund away from real estate gigaprojects. This specifically means projects like NEOM. In this report by Reuters, it states that projects have already started to be delayed, such as the Trojena project, which was meant to be completed to host the Asian Winter Games in 2029, but their hosting of the Asian Winter Games is looking to be delayed back to 2033. But importantly, it also states that work on NEOM's The Line has been scaled back to focus on completing a 2.4km stretch, which is to include a World Cup stadium. But that isn't exactly new. I mean, I literally wrote the earlier section about it only doing 2.4km at best back on the 5th of August. Well, you see, there's another detail. Having 2.4km completed makes sense if you think that perhaps they are close to having completed that much of the line already and they are simply putting it on pause. But that just isn't the case. What exists of the line currently is showcased in the Financial Times' incredible reporting on the topic. We can see in satellite imagery a bunch of excavations and tunnelling work which was to be used as the railway from the line to NEOM International Airport. On top of this, the foundations for the line's first modules are in place. That's it though. I know not many of you are architects, so let me clarify something. A foundation does not a building make. There's kind of a lot of other shit meant to go on top of it. The Financial Times states that the plan is to finish construction on 3 of the 20 planned modules. So is the line cancelled? Well, yes. No one, even MBS, thinks they will build a 170km megacity anymore. But also, no. Construction is still going ahead. That's also not to ignore the heinous things that the Saudis have done to achieve just the foundations of this part of the project. The village of Kayla, where members of the Huatat tribe lived, which was a few kilometers away from the marina at the base of the site, has been entirely razed to the ground. 15 members of the tribe protested this occurring. Now some of them sit in prison up to 50 years, and 3 others were sentenced to death. The marina itself had 100 million cubic meters of soil dug up, which is equivalent to 40 Great Pyramids of Giza. Not only has NEOM been a human tragedy, but it's an ecological one also. So the line isn't necessarily cancelled. We can't entirely rejoice. But what about the other projects? Well, Oxagon, the floating city, currently states that progress is being made and that the first phase is scheduled to be completed in 2027. Sindala, the luxury island destination, well, that's finished. They had a grand opening party last year, but despite that, it's not been open to the public at all. None of the other projects that have been mentioned have begun to be built yet, but no reports of their demise have come either. Except for one thing. The Architects Journal released a report exploring the fact that essentially the cash pipeline of NEOM to architects is starting to dry up. They specifically state that the fees the Saudis are willing to pay for their mega projects is starting to fall, but that is coming with a rise in smaller projects like Quadai, which will host an esports arena. But perhaps something more worrying is coming. You see, the Saudis have started to build their own internal teams instead of expensive international architectural firms. Something that I even said they should have been doing from the get-go. But they're only doing it due to one thing: AI. There are reports of the Saudis going from designing a concept of a building using AI and jumping immediately to constructing it, which is going to have a plethora of issues with it. You think your AI images look a little weird with some hallucinations? Now think about how you're actually going to build those hallucinations. Truly, no good can come from this. Look, we don't exactly live in a free world, unfortunately. Many of the people working for these companies, if you ask them, most likely want to cease working for their terrible bosses, let alone working for these despotic regimes. The unfortunate fact is we live in a world where if you don't work, you may end up sleeping on the streets. And also at the same time, I was just taking orders is not an excuse. Well, what is there that we can do? Well, that depends on who you are. If you're just a fan and not involved in this line of work, spread the word. Make this an issue that goes beyond just my world. I don't mean just talking about the architectural companies, but in fact the crimes these regimes are committing. As of right now, it's politically okay for these companies to associate with them. Unfortunately though, for the average person, you can't put pressure on these architectural companies. At the end of the day, you are not a consumer of theirs, and this, quite frankly, they don't care about our opinion. Though some of them, like Patrick Schumacher, definitely have a fragile ego, so publicly shitting on his work will at least hurt his feelings. But if you're one of the people working at one of these companies, now you have power. You can stop this from happening. Stop your work being used to launder the reputations of these horrific crimes. You can't do it alone though. You need your colleagues. You need a union. Here in the UK, we have a great union section of architectural workers. There's also a growing movement to unionize architecture internationally. The ones I know about are on screen. If you don't see one labeled here, just Google it, and if there isn't one that exists, check with your engineer unions or construction unions and they can help out. But with a union supporting you, you can call a strike, demand an end to working with these regimes, demand control over who your company decides to take as clients. And if not a strike, then there are other actions you can take. Purposely slow down your work while on these projects. Miss deadlines. Refuse to do overtime on these projects. Accidentally timesheet more hours onto the project than you were meant to. Slow down the projects and make them cost more. Remember, alone we beg, together we bargain.